Welcome to Marathon, the 1994 first-person shooter made by Bungie. It was a Macintosh exclusive in a time where Doom was one of the primary reasons why MS-DOS computers sold. So for Mac users, this was the closest they were able to get to Doom. Marathon is not quite as influential as a lot of its contemporaries, though it is still a highly innovative title. Compared to almost every other 90s first-person shooter, Marathon sets itself apart with its strong narrative focus. Levels are focused on an overarching story and tangible goals rather than abstractions like colored keycards. You can argue Marathon is among the first games that's truly story-driven. So, nearly 3 decades down the line, is Marathon 1 still worth playing? Has it stood the test of time as well as many other popular shooters from the time? Or has it become little more than a history piece, primarily beloved out of nostalgia? Well, that's what I played it to find out. Before I get into the game proper, I should mention that Marathon is extremely easy to acquire. In fact, it's shockingly the most accessible game I've ever covered on this channel now. Marathon is freeware since Bungie officially released the source code in 2005. Thanks to source ports, the franchise is functional on all modern operating systems. The primary source port for this series is Aleph 1, which is among the easiest to use source ports I've ever had the pleasure of dealing with. You can head over to the Aleph 1 website, download the games, and simply run them without any hassle. There are some settings you should tweak, such as upping the resolution and setting the aiming style to modern. Nothing major. Aleph 1 seems to be an excellent source port overall. It supports widescreen and has an FOV slider, which are two amazing things to have. The best thing of all, it recently received support for interpolated 60 FPS. I tried playing this game several years back, but the 30 FPS cap and a tiny FOV made it almost unplayable for me. It's a personal thing. I have a really hard time going back to older games like that. Now, it's buttery smooth and doesn't feel like I'm walking around with a periscope glued directly onto my eyeballs. Good stuff. Also, just to clear this up before anyone mentions it, use software rendering. I accidentally turned on OpenGL rendering, which gives a lot of sprites this rather grody looking rounded edge look. I thought it was just how the game looked, but it's not. I played through the whole thing like this, so forgive me for my sins. Marathon follows a security officer arriving at a ship known as the UASC Marathon. That was a title drop any percent speedrun. On board the ship, he encounters a race of hostile slaver aliens known as the Four, spelled hilariously. He is quickly contacted by Leela, one of the ship's 3 onboard AIs, and the only one who's still functioning at full capacity. In addition to the alien invasion, one of the AIs on the ship, the Randall, has gone rampant, which basically just means he's gone bonkers and become uncontrollable. So now you have to join forces to Leela, and later to Randall, to repel the alien invasion and save the Marathon. Marathon's story is a lot more fleshed out than most other shooters of the era. It attempts to have recurrent characters and logical objectives, which is a bit ahead of the game. There is one issue, and it's that Marathon's story is told entirely through text. This isn't a big deal for me, as one of my all-time favorite games is Morrowind, but it does mean that the delivery can be rather bland at times. Every major story beat is delivered through green text on a black background. This means that all of the major characters are nothing but text on the screen. I almost said, well, hey, maybe it's a technical limitation, but then I remembered that System Shock 1 had audio logs several months prior. Still, it's unfortunate that you don't really get anything beyond text crawls. It's like if you had played Doom but occasionally took a brief break to read a couple pages out of a novelization of some kind. I'll go into more detail on the story later on. You've got other channels out there if you want cringeworthy pseudo-intellectual analysis of the writing anyways. It's time for gameplay, which is my specialty. Marathon plays much like any other shooter from its era. You've got fixed health, you carry your whole arsenal at once, and you're up against escalating hordes of varied enemies. Marathon is rather interesting in that it feels a bit like an action horror game. Resources are scarce early on, save stations need to be found before you can save, and healing is often scarce. Thankfully, both save and health stations can be used an unlimited number of times. Still, it's definitely a game that wants a player to be on edge. It can be pretty tense for an action FPS at a time. Marathon was technologically ahead of the curve in 2 major ways. It was the first FPS to feature both mouse look, as we know it today, and strafing, 2 features that are incomprehensibly fundamental for first-person shooters as we know them today. Regardless, it's still unclear of how influential Marathon was, since the Mac market was rather niche in comparison to the MS-DOS market of the time. Beyond its innovations, Marathon's movement feels a lot like most other shooters at the time. You've got your borderline Olympic runner speed coupled with the inability to jump. John Marathon is true to his name. He can run forever, but never jump, since he's not named John Jump. It's a nominative determinism thing. The inability to jump is rather obnoxious in some spots, but I guess most of the game accounts for it anyways. Marathon's movement overall has a tinge of floatiness to it. This floatiness becomes way more noticeable when you're in the air, where you sink like a feather. It gets even worse into low gravity levels. Knockback is also rather odd in this game, and it's easy to get knocked around like a pinball by explosives or even random projectiles. Marathon's movement simply lacks a lot of the weight its competitor titles have. Marathon also has what's a fairly unique feature for the time, which is the motion tracker. As its name suggests, it tracks nearby motion. It's not overly useful. The instances where it's genuinely nice to have are rather few and far between. I think it's a novelty, really. Moving on, Marathon's arsenal is straightforward by today's standards, but it is unique for being the first game to feature alternative firing modes. It's also tied with Rise of the Triad as the first game to feature dual wielding since they both came out on the same day. That's a coinky dink if I've ever seen one. It's also among the first games to feature weapon reloading despite the lack of manual reloading, so if you've got uncomfortably few bullets in the mag, you should dump out the remnants of the magazine, just like in real life. A good gauge of the quality of a first-person shooter arsenal is the quality of its pistol, so how does Marathon do? It's fine, but certainly not great. It's a projectile rather than hit scan, which is rather hard for me to mentally rectify. It's a decent pistol for finishing enemies or popping popcorn, and it's the best weapon for long ranges. Dual wielding them is a tad clunky, and reloading one prevents you from firing the other for a long time. Still, it's nice that the pistol is relatively viable throughout the whole game. The assault rifle, however, is top tier, a holy grail among video game weapons at the time. It's a short-range bullet hose more so than a true assault rifle. It stun locks anything you hit with it, and it typically tears them to shreds incredibly quickly. That's not all though, as it has an underbarrel grenade launcher with a surprisingly large magazine and ammo capacity. It'll probably be your primary weapon for most of the game because of how potent and reliable it is. You can even perform grenade jumps with it, making it a useful part of movement as well. Simply a fantastic weapon. You have a handful of other weapons as well, such as the Fusion Pistol, a predecessor to Halo's Plasma Pistol. Charge it up for a more powerful blast that actually feels like it's less efficient than rapid firing it. There's a Spanker rocket launcher too, which doesn't have a familiar name at all. It's pretty powerful.
I can take it.
You got your fists, which are the obligate fallback weapon. They have the fancy pants gimmick of dealing extra damage when you're at full speed. Fisting's alright. And finally, there's a mediocre flamethrower and an alien weapon that looks like a fish to me. Those last two aren't too noteworthy, but I guess the flamethrower is notable for not being total garbage. An interesting glaring omission from this arsenal is a shotgun, with the exclusion of a shotgun from your FPS being outlawed following the buckshot facelift Doom gave the entire genre. Marathon 2 had shotgun dualies though. You can see some of the roots of combat evolved in the arsenal, with weapons doing various damage types. Explosives and plasma are more effective against armored or robotic targets, whereas ballistics and fire are more effective against organic targets. I like this general idea, which is why I'm glad that Halo kept it. Well, shame about the lack of a flamethrower in most of Halo though. Now, I'll talk about enemy design. Marathon's roster is, by today's standards, very tried and true. Nothing too unique here, but every enemy type is different, easily identifiable, and they have a different set of attacks. Some can fly, some fire fully automatic grenade launchers, and others charge you down, and so forth. Better variety than Doom 1 for sure. There's also a lot of color coding to indicate ranks. Purple is more dangerous than cyan green, and red is higher ranked than purple but lower than blue. Also, dark green is more powerful than brown when applicable. Got that? It's on the quiz later. The color coding is generally not too intuitive, it's just something you have to figure out as you go along. Sometimes they'll be invisible too, which can be really awful in some places. Most enemies fire small barrages of aim projectiles, much like how Doom's imps do it. Some fire nasty homing projectiles or rockets at you, sometimes both at once. Marathon is incredibly minimal with its hit scanners. They're still there, but hit scanners will rarely ever be a thorn in your side. So if you have an undying hatred of hit scanners, I can relate, then Marathon generally does away with that bad piece of game design. Also, enemies will infight if they hit each other, which is actually super useful in the early levels where ammo is scarce. Something notable about the enemies in this game is that their pathfinding is great for the time. Not perfect, as I did sometimes see them get stuck on each other in doorways or in the air. However, they're generally better at finding their way over to the player than even most modern games, most of the time. Refreshing to see. But you know whose pathfinding is awful? The Bobs. They're little more than friendly meat shields who get in your way. You're supposed to protect them in some missions, but it doesn't matter at all, and the game lets you progress even if you massacred them all yourself. I'm the hero! Marathon is actually the first FPS to ever feature friendly AI. You sometimes get some sentry drones to help you, or, if you forget that today's their birthday, they'll attack you. These sentry drones explode like a nuke on death, which killed me more times than I would like to admit. Like, that was some straight up BS right there. Marathon 2 and Infinity would experiment more with friendly AI and factional alignments, especially Infinity. Marathon's core gameplay is decent and is actually aged fairly well. The somewhat floaty movement can be obnoxious and I can't help but wish the game had a jump button, but neither of these are substantial issues. Both the arsenal and enemy design are good. Neither of them are too special in this day and age, but they are well-rounded, serviceable, and inventive for the time. There's plenty of little quirks that keep them surprisingly engaging. One-off enemies aren't too uncommon in Marathon, with some enemies only appearing a handful of times throughout the entire game, which is a nice way to make certain levels distinct. Speaking of levels, Marathon's level design has one of the worst batting averages I've ever seen in a first-person shooter, or, to use a terminology today's kids would use, it has a terrible KD ratio. I'd say about 1 in 3 missions here are good, so in other words, out of 27 missions, roughly 9 of which are net positives. Same batting average as Doom 1 proper, actually. Maybe these two games really were meant to be together. Taken all together, Marathon's level design is among the weakest of any first-person shooter I've ever played. While there are some things it gets right, it's still packed to the brim with issues. First off is the most obvious problem: corridors and mazes. I don't think any other game I've covered on this channel has as many narrow corridors and mazes as Marathon does. Much like crack cocaine, these things can be fine in moderation, but Marathon's level designers must have been snorting something much worse. A handful of levels did use corridors properly to create claustrophobic encounters, whereas the majority of other levels frequently throw soulless encounters and overlong featureless corridors at you. Sometimes they're shrouded in darkness and increase the likeliness you get sniped by some weenie using a fabled hide outside of the fog distance technique. And the mazes are effectively interwoven series of corridors. Marathon loves putting ambushes around corners in these mazes. The design typically makes close to no sense, and the only thing helping me stomach them is the fact that this game has a pretty good auto map, so at least that's some mercy. Not all of the levels are mazes, and there is linear or at least clear progression in a good few levels. They occasionally open up and give the player some breathing room, or they may prominently feature some sort of simple circularly navigable design. Some of the more entangled levels are nice enough to unlock shortcuts as you progress, cutting down the Minotaur LARPing a good bit. Unfortunately, that's the exception and not the rule. Here's something that can be a mixed bag. Save stations and healing stations are almost never placed in convenient locations. As a result, there's almost always a great feeling of relief whenever you find them, especially if they're in such a spot that you can make them your base of operations for the rest of the level. While their placement does increase the tension, it does feel like at least one level designer had malicious intent. A lot of the levels will hide them off in a random side area. Some levels don't even have a healing or save station, or they become inaccessible after a certain point. The game is rather inconsistent with these, and with there being no way to restore your health outside of the health stations, some levels can be brutal endurances. Personally, my biggest issue here is that the game doesn't autosave on the start of a level. Why not? That's a good voice crack. One-time save at the start of a level doesn't seem unreasonable to me. It was also genuinely frustrating how often save stations required you to clear out most of the map before you could reach them. In fact, how come the terminals rarely actually tell you anything about where the healing or save stations are? That would have been some genuinely handy advice. Leading directly from that point, despite the text dump terminals, this game frequently does a bad job communicating information with you. A lot of objectives in this game are rather vague. They might ask you to find a thing and won't show you what it looks like or where to find it beyond a microscopic snippet of the map. Man, I would have never found the objective without that extreme close-up. I needed walkthroughs a lot more often than usual because of this. On some occasions, it's simply unclear what the primary objective is. An example of this is in some of the later 4 ship levels, where I'm really not sure what you need to do to complete them. I think you need to fill out the overwhelming majority of the auto map. It's unclear, and the transitions between levels can be abrupt as a result. In the first alien level, you need to somehow know to go to a very specific window, of many dozens on the level, and that you need to look out of it in order to end the level. So not only is the objective weird, but so is the way to actually end the level. On another mission, you're expected to psychically know there's an elevator hidden behind one of the columns in the lava. The only reason anyone would look down there is because they're stumped out of their mind, so they just randomly start throwing feces at the wall to see what sticks, which is roughly an analogy for how Bungie designed most of these levels. Things that would be a secret in any other game may be intended progression in Marathon, which in my opinion is one of the lowliest things imaginable in FPS level design. This is a game that expects you to figure out how to grenade jump after all, and it's entirely possible to doom yourself if you don't know how. Ha! Doom. Now, these are ultimately only fleeting moments in the grand scheme of things. Unintuitive level design is typically something that only catches you off guard the first time around anyways. I still find it unforgivable. The painful moments of spending 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do will always stand out to me more than most enjoyable moments. It strikes me that they never had anyone outside the development team playtesting some of these levels because they're so hostile to blind play. Some levels also have an issue starting you off in immediate danger. I thought even back then Level Design 101 would tell you this is dumb, but I guess not. Bungie still didn't learn this by the time of Halo 2. You can also see some of that clown car encounter design philosophy, where you enter a room and then a dozen enemies seemingly materialize out of thin air. It's actually not bad design to feature ambushes or traps, on the contrary, but Marathon really loves to pull this card. Thankfully, ambushes in Marathon are never patently unfair, which is actually something it has over its sequel. Leading in from that is the fact that a lot of encounters can easily degrade to picking off enemies from around corners. Corner fighting, as us intellectuals call it. Enemies struggle a bit with corners, so naturally you can use them as choke points to slowly whittle down dangerous fights. Encounter design is rather choky like this. This does tie in with half the levels being corridors, for obvious reasons. It is a shame because a lot of the most engaging fights were the ones in more open arenas. In my previous videos I've coined an acronym, HEP, short for Horrible Environmental Puzzles. Marathon is not lacking in this department. One of the most widely hated levels, even among die-hard fans of Marathon, is the level Colony Ship for Sale, Cheap. Yeah, most levels in this franchise are named like that, get used to it. In this level you have to raise pillars in such a way that you can ascend up them to the end of the level. Seems pretty straightforward. Well, as it turns out, this is an absurdly time-consuming and precise puzzle. Remember, this game doesn't have a jump button, and instead has floaty physics where you ascend small height differentials. A minor miscalculation may require 5 minutes of back and forth running. The panels are obnoxiously far apart, and it takes a turtle's lifetime for each pillar to raise and lower, which is a problem in general with the game. All lifts take an obnoxious amount of time to raise and lower. Even after clearing out all of the enemies in the level, each attempt at the puzzle will take minutes on end. On top of that, each attempt requires a couple grenades. So it's a pretty bonkers puzzle. Not necessarily a brain buster, but a time waster. And be careful not to die early on in the next level. It's more likely than you think, due to the lack of an immediate health or save station and the untelegraphed introduction of a mimic enemy. If you die shortly after that puzzle, then unless you deliberately backtrack to the save station, a roughly 4 or so minute walk both ways, you're solving it all over again. Bad level design like this makes my blood boil, but hey, the level designer, Jason Jones, would apologize for this level later on. Apology denied. Plus, a lot of buttons have unclear functions. You may press a button only for seemingly nothing to happen for a while. Not only are buttons often connected to faraway things, but there's often a delay on the action playing out too. It's never a big deal, though it's still another annoyance to add to the pile. I've been disturbingly negative so far, so how about some good aspects of the level design? For one, despite how I've made it sound, there are still some relatively decent levels. Unfortunately, there weren't too many of them, but there were undoubtedly levels that were either well designed or simply outright enjoyable. Defend This, Couch Fishing, The Rose, Beware of Low-Flying Defense Drones, and Try Again are a handful of these fun levels. They usually feature some experimental level design while also being decently paced with good combat, so they're easy picks for some of the best levels. Though it's ultimately sparsely used in Marathon's level design, something Bungie advertises 5D space. That is, non-Euclidean geometry. It's a shame that it's primarily used in a secret in the final level of the game. There are some more subtle applications of it, like in the level Bob BQ or extremely subtly in Couch Fishing. Kinda underused if you ask me. Secrets are a thing, but they tend to be few and far between on top of being a little obtuse. They're usually secret walls, buttons that activate things far away, and obscure environmental puzzles. Interestingly, Marathon doesn't keep tally of kills or secrets found per level, unlike most of its competitors. And there's plenty of experimental level design in Marathon, and I do at least admire the ambition. Most of the environmental puzzles relate to pushing a button and getting on the right platform, but it's an interesting attempt to mix up the gameplay. You have little one-off things like the vacuum level G4 sunbathing, which requires you to maintain an oxygen meter and prevents uses of your assault rifle. Of course, you also have things like occasional allied AI and enemies unique to 1 or 2 levels. Sometimes you might be sniping buttons from far away with your grenade launcher, which is surprisingly satisfying. I want you to be surprised by some things, so I won't show every little funky bit of level design. Ultimately, Marathon's level design is at least innovative and can be quite clever. I did decide to do some research on who did what levels. There are 4 level designers in total: Greg Kirkpatrick, Jason Jones, Alexander Seropian, and Reginald Dujour. I don't care if I pronounce any of those wrong. Probably about 75% of the game was done by Kirkpatrick and Jones. Hilariously, almost every level I absolutely despised was done by Jason Jones. He did a decent helping of the good levels too, though, so I guess his level design is incredibly polarizing for me. Kirkpatrick's level design is consistently passable to decent. I didn't hate anything he made. The other two tended to collaborate with others and are consistently rather okay in quality, with most of their work being on the alien ship levels. Let's just say that Jason Jones was Bungie's equivalent to id Sandy Peterson. Overall, Marathon's level design is pretty subpar as a whole. It's not without its moments, but the unpleasantries often outnumber the pleasantries. Marathon can really feel like you're running a 42.195 kilometer foot race sometimes. The good levels are always refreshing and enjoyable, but they're no knee deep into dead, and the rest of the level design can vary from being weaker than average to outright terrible. To be fair to Marathon, it came out at a highly experimental time for the genre. People were still figuring out what worked and what didn't. However, I analyze games from the perspective of today. If the game didn't age well, then it didn't age well. Conventions weren't fully established and the technology is still relatively primitive, so Marathon ends up suffering from many of the common issues old school level design had, with a decent handful of its own relatively unique problems sprinkled in there. Marathon's level design is simply hurt badly by its age. It's not as fun today as it probably was back then. Let's move along. Marathon is, or was, a technically impressive game. It's not too astounding by today's standards, but it is a cut above Doom, as it's one of the first games to feature room-over-room technology. It's obviously a bit hacky, as most implementations of room-over-room were until Quake, but it's fairly convincing nonetheless. In fact, they use it to make rooms outright overlap with each other, creating some trippy effects. Bungie's officially called this technology 5D space, which makes me wonder where the 4D space is. Maybe it got lost in 6D space. Oh, also, it's got 256 colors. That's every color known to man. But in terms of actual visuals, well, Marathon isn't too visually distinct throughout much of its runtime. In fact, you're probably quite familiar with the grayish-brown rectangular corridors you'll be seeing a lot of. I find it rather funny that the most boring environment in Marathon is the Marathon itself. I'm personally never really impressed by human ships in sci-fi. They're typically too utilitarian and gray to be interesting. Marathon also has its levels designed in such a way that it's often hard to tell what the places are supposed to be. You know how Doom 2 is called Hell on Earth when it's almost impossible to tell it's supposed to take place on Earth? It's a very similar deal with Marathon, where places are too abstract to really be identifiable in any way. It's easy to forget you're on a spaceship sometimes. Where this abstract feel does benefit the game, however, is when you're on the 4 ship. These levels are a treat in the visuals department. They're a massive departure from the Marathon itself, being curvy, purple, and even more abstract. Marathon really nails the feeling of being alone on an incomprehensible alien ship. These purple corridors feel familiar. It'd be really funny if it was because Bungie made 2 games that have alien collectives that use purple ships as antagonists. Ultimately, Marathon 1 is rather sporadic visually. The technology is impressive for the time and the sprite work is decent. I feel like a lot of the sprites have a slightly comic book feel to them, which makes them look a little out of place if you stare hard enough. The corridors and geometry simply didn't age too well, and there's a lack of visual variety throughout most of the game. The 4 ships are a welcome change of pace, but even they end up blending together a little. Now, for sound design. Marathon sound design is nothing special. How many times have I said something like that on my channel at this point? Marathon does suffer from its age a little here, as there are very few sound effects overall. It's obviously tried to get some good mileage out of some of them too. Projectiles often make the same stock punching sound your fists do, for instance. But they do a good job with having sound effects being varied too. Almost every enemy type has its own unique set of sounds. Enemies also have unique death sounds and sprites for being killed with a flamethrower or explosives. All weapons in their alt fires also have unique sounds and tend to sound pretty good. Most of it can be rather stock because Most of it is stock. I think the best thing I can say in general about the sound design is that there's nothing bad here and very little of it is out of place. Marathon's soundtrack is also rather standout. In fact, it's actually quite excellent. It's often more ambient and action-packed. However, that doesn't mean it's just a low drone. It's still got the stuff that makes a good soundtrack, like composition and instruments. There's a good few tracks on here that feel like drifting through space or like being stuck alone on an incomprehensible alien spaceship. Oh, I used that before. These ambient tracks are great, even if they aren't fitting for the chaos erupting on screen. I personally think they nailed the soundtrack for the most part. The only problem I have with the music is that some of the more active tracks can be a bit off-putting in terms of sound. It's odd to suddenly go from calm, eerie space music to a clown boss fight MIDI. I'm not even sure if these tracks originally sounded like this, but I imagine it is ultimately the limitation of MIDI files that cause these faster tracks to sound a tad goofy. I am exaggerating a tad, though I undoubtedly preferred the ambience over the more intense stuff. Anyways, I'm gonna finish up talking about the story. It's mostly just gonna be a summary. Go to this timestamp on screen if you don't want to get spoiled. You good? The people left will never get to know that the universe closes in 15.1937921021588 years. Despite Marathon seemingly presenting as a grand sci-fi epic, Marathon 1's story isn't all that complicated. The sequels are where it gets complicated. Here, it's a simple affair. Aliens are invading your ship and an onboard AI has, as intellectuals call it, gone nuts. You work with Leela, the commanding AI, for a decent chunk of the game. Durandal, the rampant AI in charge of doors and life support, occasionally swoops by to abduct you, send you to the alien ship, or share his high school poetry assignments with you. The third AI, Taika, only has a minor presence in this game and comes back in the sequels. At about the halfway point, Leela goes offline and Durandal takes over as your personal objective giver guy. He has you scout out the alien ships where you eventually do some stuff to free an enslaved alien race, the Sphit. For the final stress of the game, you get to fight alongside these homing projectile-spewing meanies who've bullied you the whole game. Durandal then reactivates Leela so that you can do one last task. Whatever that task is, I'm still not completely sure. The final level is rather disappointing with no climactic battle or interesting objectives. Aside from the 5D maze, it feels like a filler level. The game ends rather abruptly without any fanfare, and to nobody's shock, you only get a big old wall of text. Just before the end, Durandal reveals to you that you are effectively a distraction, which has helped him steal a 4-ship capable of FTL travel. A terminal and a secret within a secret reveals that, shortly before the events of the game, he went rampant and beckoned the 4-ship to come over to the Marathon in the hopes that he could steal it. Yes, there are story beats hidden in secrets. Regardless, thanks to you, this crazy, morally ambiguous AI of the God Complex now has access to advanced alien FTL technology. Good job. Wait, a 1994 shooter about an AI with a God complex. Overall, I think Marathon's story is pretty good. It's light years ahead of most other shooters from the same era. I think it has Half-Life beaten in terms of story, but Half-Life did a better job with its means of conveying the story. Does that make sense? Marathon's methods of storytelling are admittedly rather primitive, with most of it being told through plain text. However, it's ambitious for the time. In fact, it's actually rather unique for a video game story to be comprised entirely of abstract, faceless characters who only exist in text. There's an attempt to build a world outside of the UESC Marathon itself. Lore may be the sole prize you get from a secret. The game can be subtle with a lot of the little details, though sometimes the subtlety falls flat on its face, like when the game says there's 10 Mjolnir cyborgs and then the final terminal in the game said that there are 9 Mjolnir cyborgs on the planet below, blatantly implying that the player is the 10th cyborg. It's at least typically well written, and I was more willing to read the sci-fi walls of text than usual here. That's a pretty good compliment. The Marathon series is a trilogy. I finished Marathon 2 shortly before editing this video together, but I probably won't make a video on it. I'm yet to play through Infinity as of posting this. Marathon 2 is most of the good of Marathon 1 with less of the bad. The core gameplay is incredibly similar, however, it's been streamlined and tweaked in a lot of minor ways. It also saw a huge visual facelift and environments are never as bland as they were in Marathon 1. The addition of dual-wield double-barrel shotguns, new enemy types, and water are all nice bonuses that round out the package. Marathon 2 still suffers in the level design department, however. It has some of that old FPS enemy literally teleports behind you rotten garbage that I absolutely despise. Marathon 1 almost never did anything remotely like that, surprisingly. There's also some levels with infinite enemy respawns, which is another cardinal sin, and underwater segments that sometimes outstay their welcome. The alien ship levels are also incomprehensibly worse in Marathon 2. Like, holy cow, are they astoundingly badly designed. Every room is a different missed opportunity or design atrocity. And what's with the clown wallpaper? Also, they did away with the music in Marathon 2 and Infinity. I'm not sure why, because it was a massive part of the atmosphere in Marathon 1. The sequels are outright dead silent sometimes. What a huge downgrade. This video is focused on Marathon 1, so I am skipping out on a lot of details on 2 and Infinity. Simply summarized, they are improvements in a good few ways and downgrades in some other ways. And these days, it's hard not to talk about Marathon without briefly addressing Bungie's future project, Halo. Given my general liking of Halo, I thought it was quite natural to want to go back and check out Marathon. You can certainly see some of the seeds of Halo here. The purple alien ships, the Majoraner cyborgs, AI rampancy, the Spanker, plasma weapons being more effective against shielded enemies, and so forth. Notably, you can see the Marathon logo in tons of places throughout Halo. One most significant reference is the security armor, which is heavily modeled after the armor worn by the protagonist of Marathon, who is a security officer. Entire multiplayer maps in Halo are recreations of multiplayer maps from Marathon. If you're familiar with both franchises, then the influences and references are not that subtle, and you'll find them if you're obsessive enough. Obviously, Bungie was quite proud of Marathon. I wanted to dash your crossover fanfiction hopes and dreams, but after looking into it, I discovered that there's no confirmation whether or not Marathon and Halo take place in the same universe. They do share some terminology, and the Marathon logo comes up a lot in Halo, but references in similar sci-fi concepts are just that. That rampancy exists in both the Halo and Marathon universes isn't a concrete connection between the two. Since Bungie loves scattering the Marathon logo around, I think it's most reasonable to assume that AI rampancy is a lore element they liked enough to reuse. There's nothing disproving them taking place in the same universe, but nothing that really proves it either. Pure speculation either way, and it gets a lot weirder if you include Marathon Infinity in that speculation. What are my final thoughts on Marathon? Well, Marathon 1. Honestly, I liked a decent bit of it. Despite it being a product of a time, it still holds up relatively well today in some ways. It has its issues, mostly with level design, but it's an experience worth a look if you're into the subgenre. That subgenre being authentic 90s shooters. Maybe it's worth a look if you're into Halo and want to see where Bungie got their start, too. As a result, yeah, you should try Marathon. Despite not aging perfectly, it's still a solid shooter with a story told in a primitive but rather unique way. It's a highly experimental and ambitious game that comes across as almost the inverse of Doom. While it's still an action FPS, its somber space horror atmosphere is a stark contrast to Doom's campy atmosphere. Marathon sits in this interesting middle ground between Doom and System Shock, where it weaves Doom-like action with its System Shock-like emphasis on story, objectives, and level structure. It's free and it takes almost no effort to set up, so you won't lose out on anything but time, and I guess hard drive space. I do recommend you try pushing through the first 3 or so levels if you aren't finding yourself too interested at first. Marathon is a slower burn than Doom for sure, so it requires a bit more patience from the player than usual. According to the in-game timer, which seems a little faulty, this game took me just shy of 7 hours to beat. Pretty standard runtime for a blind playthrough of an old school shooter, and it ends when it starts to outstay its welcome. I know I've said a lot of bad things about the level design, but if you can play through Doom 1, you can certainly play through this. Oh, pop quiz. Which color indicates a higher rank? Red or dark green? That's a trick question. No single enemy type in Marathon comes in red and dark green. I told you it's intuitive. Anyways, that's all for this episode. I'm probably not covering the sequels as I said, but I've lied about what I'm covering next before, so... The next game will be a pretty rage-inducing game by id. Tune in for that. See you then, maybe, probably.